The night it all changed, the dining room at Maison d'Orval smelled of seared duck confit and money. Not the honest kind of money, the kind earned through long shifts and aching feet, but the other kind. The kind that had been sitting in trust funds long enough to develop its own particular scent, something between aged cognac and quiet contempt. Delphine Aubert had learned to recognize it in her first week on the floor. She had also learned, very quickly, to become invisible. That was the job, really. Not the order-taking, not the wine pairing, not the careful choreography of plates arriving and departing without a single unnecessary word. The job was to move through the room like air, present enough to be useful, absent enough to be forgotten. At 28, Delphine had become extraordinarily good at it. She didn't intend to be a waitress at Maison d'Orval indefinitely. She had intended to finish her biochemistry degree at McGill, then her master's, then perhaps her doctorate. She had intended a great many things before the night her mother collapsed in the kitchen of their Verdun apartment, and the CT scan came back with a word that rearranged every future Delphine had ever imagined for herself. Glioblastoma. 4 syllables that cost everything. She'd told herself it was temporary. That was 14 months ago. Now she stood near the service corridor, a silver water pitcher condensing cool drops onto her palm, watching the room fill with the particular kind of Thursday evening crowd that frequented Maison d'Orval. Board members, developers. The odd federal minister, who thought the prix-fixe menu conferred a kind of privacy. The maitre d', a narrow man named Fontaine, who wore his authority like a second jacket, had seated a party of 4 at table 6 just before 8 o'clock. Delphine's section. She noted them the way she noted everyone. Quickly, without appearing to look. The man who had made the reservation was in his mid-40s, the kind of handsome that came less from genetics and more from access to good tailoring and uninterrupted sleep. Oliver Hext. She knew the name because Fontaine had said it twice, which meant Mr. Hext was the kind of man whose name Fontaine said twice. He sat at the head of the table, broad-shouldered, easy in his skin, already leaning toward the woman to his left, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. That woman was younger, sharp-featured, impeccably groomed, wearing the particular expression of someone perpetually calculating their next move while performing warmth for an audience. Her name, Delphine would learn later from the reservation notes, was Claudette Renaud-Soper, Oliver's fiancée, recently announced, already photographed at 2 charity galas. Across the table sat a man Delphine placed as Oliver's younger brother. Same jaw, less polish, a slight restlessness in the way he held his menu, and beside him, on the outside chair that faced the room, sat an older woman. She was perhaps 70, with the kind of posture that had once been called regal and was now called stubborn, and white hair cut close in a style that suited her entirely. Her clothes were good, but not showy. Her hands rested flat on the tablecloth in front of her, fingers slightly spread, and she was watching the room with the focused, slightly effortful attention of someone reading lips from a distance. Something shifted in Delphine's chest. She had seen that look before, the slight tilt of the head, the way the woman's eyes tracked the movement of mouths rather than eyes, the particular stillness that comes from a body that has reorganized itself around the loss of one sense and compensated fiercely with the others. Delphine had seen it every Sunday afternoon for the past 6 years, sitting across from her tante Marcella at the kitchen table in Laval, spelling words onto her aunt's palm when the light was too low for lip reading. She approached the table. "Good evening. I'm Delphine, and I'll be looking after you tonight." She made eye contact with each of them in turn. Oliver, then Claudette, then the brother, and finally the older woman. And as she reached her, She let her right hand settle naturally at her chest and signed, softly, "Welcome. I hope you're comfortable." The woman's eyes went wide, not with alarm, with something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. Her hands came up from the tablecloth and she signed back, her movements practiced and fluent, but touched with the slight hesitation of someone who hasn't had cause to use their language in a very long time. "You know ASL?" Delphine smiled and signed, "LSQ, mostly. But yes, are you warm enough? The table near the window can be drafty." The woman, Delphine didn't yet know her name, pressed her fingers briefly to her lips, the universal gesture of someone trying very hard not to cry in public. Then she signed, "I am now." Oliver was watching this exchange with an expression Delphine could not immediately classify. It wasn't displeasure, but it wasn't entirely comfortable either, the look of a man confronted with evidence of something he had been avoiding. His brother was leaning forward, slightly, openly curious. Claudette was smiling, but the smile had the quality of a lid placed over something that was not smiling at all. "My mother is, she doesn't hear," Oliver said, then stopped, as though he'd intended to say more and thought better of it. "Of course," Delphine said. She turned back to his mother and signed, "Would you prefer I direct any questions about your meal to you directly?" The woman, she signed her name as Miriam, answered immediately, "Please. Yes, please." There was a ferocity in that please that Delphine felt in her sternum. She took the table's orders the way she took all orders, attentively, without fuss. Claudette requested several modifications to 2 different dishes with the practiced fluency of someone who had made the same requests many times at many restaurants and understood the modifications as a kind of performance. Oliver ordered efficiently, like a man who had made peace with the menu before he arrived. The brother, whose name was Declan, he offered it himself with a grin, asked Delphine's honest opinion between 2 dishes, and seemed genuinely interested in her answer. For Miriam, Delphine signed each option slowly, described the textures, asked about her preferences. Did she prefer fish or fowl? Was she avoiding anything? The older woman answered with growing animation, her hands loosening, her posture changing in a way that made her look, gradually, younger. Oliver watched the whole exchange from across the table with that same complicated expression. Claudette's smile had not moved. Delphine retreated to the service corridor. She put the order through, picked up a different table's appetizers, moved through the room on its invisible current, but she found herself glancing back at table 6 more than she meant to. Not from nosiness, but from the particular vigilance of someone who has learned to read a room's temperature at a distance. Claudette was speaking. Miriam was watching her, but Claudette's face was angled slightly away, and her mouth moved quickly, with the slight deliberateness of someone who knows the person across from them cannot follow. It might have been nothing. Delphine had seen careless people before, people who forgot, or who simply didn't think to adjust. But Claudette's eyes didn't have the vagueness of forgetting. They had the calculation of intention. Miriam's hands were back flat on the tablecloth. Her expression had gone quiet in the way that Delphine recognized from her tante Marcel after a long day of being in a hearing world, a kind of careful withdrawal, the face a person puts on when they have decided the effort of participation is no longer worth the cost. Delphine returned with the first course and made sure to sign the description of each dish directly to Miriam before setting it down. The older woman signed, "You're very kind." Then, more quickly, with a glance across the table, "She speaks too fast on purpose. She knows I can't follow." Delphine kept her expression neutral. She signed back, "I noticed. I'll make sure you're included in everything tonight." What happened next was her first mistake, if you could call it that. She doesn't. She had been circling back to the table more frequently than strictly necessary. Water refills, small check-ins, each one giving her an excuse to translate any conversation Miriam might be missing. She was careful about it. She didn't position herself as an interpreter. She simply remained present enough that Miriam never had to go very long without knowing what was being said at her own table. It was during one of these circuits, just as Delphine was leaning in to refill the water glasses, that Claudette turned to her with the full force of a particular kind of smile, the kind that contains a warning dressed as pleasantry. "We appreciate the attentiveness," Claudette said. Her voice was warm, precise, carrying just enough volume that Oliver and Declan could hear. "But I think the table is well taken care of. Perhaps your other guests need you more." It was said beautifully, the kind of dismissal that arrives gift-wrapped, so that if you object you seem unreasonable, and if you comply you've already lost. Delphine straightened. "Of course," she said. "Let me know if you need anything." She signed to Miriam before she stepped away. "I'll be close by. Flag me anytime." Miriam's response was immediate. "Don't go far." She didn't. The kitchen was warm and loud and smelled of butter and the particular metallic edge of a commercial range running hot. Delphine stood at the pass, waiting on a plate, and ran the calculation she'd been running since the appetizer course. Whatever was happening at that table, whatever history existed between a woman who had lost her hearing and the young fiancé who spoke too fast on purpose, it was not her business. She thought of her mother in the hospital bed at the Montreal Neurological Institute, 3 weeks post-surgery and fighting. She thought of the medical bills that had organized themselves into a stack on the counter of their Verdun apartment, each one a small monument to the distance between what was owed and what was possible. She thought about what it had cost to get this job and what it would cost to lose it. She went back to the table. The main course arrived, and with it a shift in the atmosphere. Oliver was speaking something. Something about a property development near Mont Tremblant, the details of which Declan seemed genuinely interested in. Claudette was contributing, animated and informed, her hand occasionally landing on Oliver's forearm in the particular way of someone claiming a public possession. Miriam was eating quietly. She had turned slightly in her chair, so her back was at a small angle to Claudette, not rudely, not dramatically, but in the way a plant turns from shade. Delphine signed during a water refill. "Are you enjoying the main?" Miriam signed, "Yes." "It's good." Then, "She's been telling Oliver I've been unwell, that I've been confused, that my doctor recommended I move to a care facility." Delphine's hand paused on the picture. Miriam continued, her movements precise and controlled, a woman choosing each word carefully. "None of it is true. I am not confused. I live alone in Westmount, and I manage my own affairs perfectly well. But he worries about me, and she is very good at worrying on his behalf." Delphine set the picture down. She signed. "Does Oliver know what she's been saying to him?" Miriam's expression was the answer. The sorrow of someone who has watched someone they love be slowly, expertly redirected. "He loves her," Miriam signed. "He believes her. She's been careful, slow, like water." Delphine thought about that word, slow. Not a sudden campaign, but a gradual one. A shift of perception, a softening of trust, a gentle installation of doubt. She had read about it in a psychology elective she'd taken in her second year at McGill. She had not expected to recognize it at a dinner table in Montreal. She signed, "Has your doctor actually recommended a care facility?" "No. My doctor is Dr. Pham at the Westmount Clinic. I see her every 4 months. Last visit she told me my blood work was excellent. Is there someone you trust who knows the situation?" Miriam hesitated. "Then my nephew, in Halifax. But she has." Oliver's phone is shared now, calendar, everything. It became a system I don't understand how to navigate. My messages go through a tablet she configured. Something cold settled in Delphine's stomach, the tablet, the shared calendar. the careful management of access disguised as helpfulness. She signed, "Okay, I want to help you, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Miriam looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone who has learned to be very careful about trust, and who is now deciding whether to be careful about one more person. Then she signed, "Yes." Delphine returned to the service corridor and did not let herself think too hard about what she was considering, because if she thought too hard, she would stop. She found Fontaine near the host stand. "The party at table 6, she said. "The older woman, Miriam Hext. I need 60 seconds. It's important." Fontaine looked at her with the expression he reserved for staff who complicated his evenings. "Delphine, I know. I just need 60 seconds, please." He gave her 60 seconds, though his expression made clear it was a loan, not a gift. She went back to the table during the small natural pause before dessert, when Oliver and Declan had stepped briefly toward the bar to greet someone they knew, and Claudette was on her phone with the particular absorption of someone who believed the moment was private. Delphine crouched slightly beside Miriam's chair. No theater, no urgency, just the natural posture of someone speaking quietly to a seated guest, and signed, "My phone number. I'm going to write it on your receipt and give you a copy of tonight's order summary, which you'll receive at the end of the meal. It'll look like routine paperwork." Miriam nodded very slightly. "Give it to someone you trust. A phone call if you can, your nephew in Halifax." Miriam's hands moved. "What if it doesn't help?" Delphine signed. "Then you haven't lost anything. But right now the only person in this room who knows what you've just told me is you and me. That matters." Oliver and Declan were returning from the bar. Delphine straightened and reached for the water pitcher, a gesture she had performed perhaps 200 times that evening, and was already in motion before Claudette looked up from her phone. She didn't know if Claudette had seen the exchange. She suspected she had. The dessert course was ordered and delivered with perfect correctness. Miriam had a slice of the pear tart. She signed to Delphine as it arrived, "My favorite." A small declaration, a return of something. Claudette, for her part, had become very still. The warmth remained in her face, but it had a different quality now. Focused, watchful. She said very little for the remainder of the meal. When Delphine brought the bill, she placed the order summary on the table as she had said she would. Folded, routine, slipped quietly beside Miriam's dessert fork without ceremony. Miriam's hand moved to it, and it was gone, into the small clutch bag she'd kept on her lap all evening. The table settled, rose, exchanged the small courtesies of departure. Oliver shook Declan's hand at the door. Miriam gathered her things with careful dignity. As she passed, she paused beside Delphine. Her hand, briefly, touched Delphine's wrist, just for a moment, just long enough to sign a single word. "Thank you." She was out the door before Delphine could respond. The evening moved on. Other tables, other orders, the slow contraction of the dining room as it emptied toward midnight. Delphine rolled silverware and tried not to turn the night over and over in her hands like a stone she couldn't put down. She had given a dinner guest her phone number. She had suggested a woman contact her family to circumvent her future daughter-in-law. She had, depending on how you arranged the facts, potentially interfered in the private affairs of a very wealthy family. Or she had done the only thing a person with her particular knowledge and her particular position could have done for a woman who had been, quietly and effectively, cut off from everyone who might help her. She was wiping down the service station when Claudette came back, not through the main entrance, through the bar which connected to the dining room through a short corridor that Delphine knew most guests didn't notice. She was alone, Oliver's coat folded over one arm, her phone already put away, her expression quite calm. "Delphine," she said, as though they were acquainted. Delphine set down the cloth. "Messieurs Renaud Soper, can I help you? I think you know what I want to discuss." Claudette's voice was very pleasant. It was the pleasantness of someone who has never had to raise their voices to achieve what she wanted and wasn't planning to start now. "I don't know what you think you saw this evening. I don't know what Miriam might have communicated to you, in whatever, signing, and I'm sure she's very convincing, she always is, but I want to be clear about something." She paused, not for effect, or not only for effect, but in the way of someone choosing their words with precision. "Oliver is a very good person. He trusts me. The arrangements we've made for Miriam's care are out of love for her, not anything else, and I would hate for a misunderstanding to cause unnecessary difficulty for someone in your position." There it was, the shape of it, finally visible. Delphine held it for a moment, felt the familiar physics of this kind of pressure, the way it located itself exactly on the point of vulnerability, and leaned. She thought about the stack of bills on her counter. She thought about her mother's surgery, the next round of imaging, the particular fluorescent light of waiting rooms. She thought about Fontaine, who was already watching her from across the room. Then she thought about Miriam's hand, saying, "She speaks too fast on purpose." "I appreciate you saying that," Delphine said. "I hope the rest of your evening is lovely." She went back to rolling silverware. Claudette stood for a moment, then she left. The call came on a Tuesday, 11 days later. Delphine was eating lunch in the small staff room behind the kitchen when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, a 902 area code, which she had to look up before she remembered. Halifax. His name was Thomas Hext, and he was Miriam's nephew, and he had been trying for 3 months to reach his aunt through channels that, it turned out, had been quietly redirected. He had driven to Montreal the previous weekend. He had hired a solicitor. He had had a very long conversation with Oliver, who had not been angry, not the way Claudette had perhaps counted on, but had instead gone very quiet in the specific way of someone who is assembling, piece by piece, a picture they had not wanted to see. "She told me about you," Thomas said. "She wanted me to tell you." "Is she all right? She's home. She's better." "She's asking about dinner at Maison Dorval, actually. She wants to come back." Delphine laughed, which surprised her. What happened to Claudette was not dramatic in the end. There was no confrontation she attended, no scene. Oliver's publicist released a brief statement 2 weeks later about the end of an engagement. No further details were shared, and none were needed. Delphine read it on her phone in the hospital waiting room at the Montreal Neurological Institute during her mother's follow-up imaging appointment. Her mother's scan was good. Not clear, the word the oncologist used was stable, which 14 months into a glioblastoma diagnosis was a word that carried the full weight of what it wasn't saying while still being the best word Delphine had heard in a very long time. She held it carefully on the drive home. She was back at Maison Dorval that Friday evening when Fontaine appeared at her elbow during the pre-service lineup and said, in his particular tone of managed neutrality, that she was to call the restaurant's general manager before her next shift. She did. The general manager's name was Geneviève Ouellet, and she had been running Maison Dorval for 11 years with the particular authority of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by very little. She asked Delphine to come in on her day off. She asked over coffee in the office behind the cellar what had happened at table 6 on the Thursday 3 weeks prior. Delphine told her, all of it. Geneviève listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Oliver Hext called me directly. He wanted to know who you were." Delphine waited. He also made a very substantial donation to the hospital auxiliary fundraiser that the restaurant supports each year. Geneviève paused. He said the impetus was a staff member who reminded him that some things matter more than the appearance of things. She looked at Delphine. I don't typically offer front-of-house staff positions in event planning and private dining coordination. It's not a role I've advertised. Delphine said, No. Your background is in biochemistry, according to your original application, in incomplete degree AB, McGill, though, which means you left something substantial behind. Genevieve folded her hands on the desk. There are research affiliations attached to this restaurant's ownership group. There are also, for what it's worth, continuing education arrangements we've supported for staff in the past. None of that is what I'm offering you today. What I'm offering you today is a promotion and a conversation about what comes next, if you want one. Delphine thought about the stack of bills that had, in the past 2 weeks, begun to look slightly less like a verdict and slightly more like a problem she was in the process of solving. She thought about the word stable and how much room it left for things to get better. Yes, she said, I'd like that. Miriam Hext came back to Maison Dorval on a Saturday evening in November with Thomas, and without fanfare. She wore the same simple, well-chosen clothes as before. She had the same upright posture, the same careful attention to the room around her. When Delphine came to her table, Miriam looked up and her hands moved before anything else did. You're still here. Delphine signed back, for now. It's a good place. Miriam smiled. Not the small, careful smile she had worn on her first visit. The smile of someone practicing the management of disappointment, but an open one. A smile that belonged entirely to itself. She signed, Thank you for not being afraid. Delphine thought about that on the metro home, her feet aching pleasantly in the way they always did after a long floor shift, her phone light in her coat pocket, the city moving past in its familiar rhythm outside the window. She thought about the particular courage of that, not being afraid, and whether it was an accurate description of what she'd felt that night, which it wasn't entirely. She had been afraid. She had done it anyway. There was something in that distinction that felt important. She filed it away alongside all the other important things she planned to think about properly once she had more time. The train emerged briefly above ground between stations, the November sky very black and very full of stars, and Delphine Aubert sat in the yellow light of the car and thought, Things can turn. It is a small thought. It is the thought that makes everything else possible.